Hey, everyone. Welcome this evening. And wanted to apologize. I did not have a show um, this past week because I had another speaking opportunity that I had already signed up for several months ago. So that ended up being on the time that I normally have my show. But this week, I wanted to share with everybody that I am having Philip Agnew on the show this Thursday at 8 p.m. He is one of the founders of the Dream Defenders down in Florida. And now he is working on a new project called Black Man Build. So we'll talk a lot about that and just, what he's up to right now. Also, I am finishing up the choice tonight with you all. So, if you've had an opportunity to join me with this series, it's actually been a very, very enlightening series. And I really hope that you all have enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed reading it to you. Really quickly, just to give some background for people who may be new here. This is the seventh part, likely our final reading, because we only have this much left to go. So I'm hoping I can tie that up with you all tonight. But meantime, hit the like button, share, because this last part is actually getting really good. If you haven't had an opportunity, I encourage everyone to go back to start from part one. And the reason why I am reading this book is because it is one of those shadow banned books. As I've talked about it, the other readings, the author, who is an ancestor now, Samuel Yet, was the very first African American Newsweek bureau chief for Washington, D.C. back in 1971. And because of Richard Nixon, the president at the time, this book was so explosive, the president had him fired. And now, if you go on to Amazon or anywhere to try to find this book, the cost is really astronomical. It is absolutely astronomical. So I am reading this book as a service to our community so that we can connect the dots between what has happened during this time and why this book was so explosive, but also we can connect the dots on what's happening now and also some of the things that are coming down the pipe. And it's this book so far has just been an eye opener. I mean, it was very well vetted, very well researched, and reading this book, I could see how it was so explosive and controversial at the time. So without further ado, again, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We'll probably be finishing up tonight. So it took us 7 readings to get through this entire book. I'd love for you all to drop in the chat which book, a suggestion for which book I should read next on this channel. One of the books that I've been thinking about that I should read on this channel is Blueprint for Black Power by Dr. Amos Wilson. That's his magnum opus, in my opinion. That book is about 1,000 pages. So it would literally take me a very long time to read that book. But I would love to see comments on the next reading suggestion that you all have for me. And I'd be happy to try to oblige, especially if I already have it in my library. I already have most of Amos Wilson's books in my library. So make sure you like the video and share it so we can get more people in to get this good knowledge. This is very good knowledge. So we are on page 278, and I'm going to go ahead and get started with the final reading of the choice. Thank you for joining me. Page 278, it says, "It is at least a noteworthy coincidence that the Mccarran Act was adopted at the outset of the Korean War, the country's first big undeclared war in violation of the Constitution, and became a pronounced threat during the second such war, the war in Indochina. Both wars were undeclared and neither was popular, although anti-war sentiment was far sharper over the latter. The act itself and the 6 camps ready for use in 1952 stood as subtle reminders to those who would oppose either such a war or demonstratively oppose oppression at home. The fact that the camps were intended for practical use beyond their symbolic effect quickly became a matter of record. Allen's 1966 exposition recalls how Attorney General J. Howard McGrath announced on New Year's Eve in 1952 that the 6 camps were for occupancy. Then, Allen states, quote, "Within 2 weeks, Senator James Eastland, Democrat of Mississippi, the ranking member of the Internal Security Subcommittee charged with overseeing the Mccarran Act, placed a bill before the Senate demanding that a state of internal security emergency be declared immediately by Congress. He insisted he had reliable information that 50,000 communists were ready to overthrow the government of the United States. If we are to keep faith with those of our own flesh and blood who are facing the bullets of the communists on the battlefields of Korea, the least we can do is to promptly seize and detain under lock and key each and every one of the 50,000 identifiable, trained, and hardened traitors," he said. Against the rising tide of McCarthyism at home and a sensational reverse in the Korean War abroad, the United Press reported that J. Howard McGrath had expanded the Justice Department's Internal Security Division and was quietly pushing a program pinpointing dangerous subversives for immediate arrest at a time of emergency. End quote. The Allen exposition continues. Master pickup lists had already been prepared in Washington on the basis of many thousands of FBI reports. The wire service stated, and Operation Dragnet, which was the code name for the mass arrest, could start a roundup of tens of thousands of potential spies and saboteurs within a few hours. Justice Department officials, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, are understood to feel that the program is necessary to make sure an anti-subversive roundup can be carried out without confusion and as quickly as possible, the added. Even the Chicago Daily Tribune, that caricature of a Midwest reaction, found all of these developments too much. Denouncing concentration camps in America, a long, thoughtfully, and well-written editorial published a few days after the announcement of the selection of the 6 campsites, underscored the feeling of many Americans when it pointed out that the zeal of the Attorney General is getting ready to put this section of the Internal Security Act into effect is strange and ominous. The constitutional rights of the individual now face dangers without precedent, and the Truman administration could easily use the Korean War as pretext for the jailing of political opponents or critics of the existing administration. A man or woman can simply be made to disappear into a federal concentration camp without even anybody knowing of his or her fate or coming forward to defend him or her, the newspaper warned. Considering the existence of both enabling law and camps in readiness, it is remarkable that the concentration camps were not, as such, knowingly used during the 1960s. The explanation may be simply that the right combination, the men and the circumstances, had not quite gelled. Ramsey Clark's denial of the existence of the camps probably indicated more of a revulsion from the truth than an ignorance of the facts. But the same cannot be said of such men as Assistant Attorney General Richard Clandestine, his boss, Attorney General John Mitchell, or even President Nixon, who, after all, was a co-sponsor of the Mccarran Act, even during the Johnson administration, would have provided opportunities too tempting to believe that under the Nixon administration they would have been rejected. For example, the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, let me see where did I stop, would have been prime opportunity to invoke Title II of the Mccarran Act. Washington burned for several more days before the violence in the aftermath subsided. In the interim, President Johnson had permitted the city of Washington to employ an unusual policy of leniency, which kept down the fatalities and injuries from police reaction to the violence and looting. Even so, scores of Blacks were arrested, were taken to detention facilities in Virginia after those in the District of Columbia were filled to capacity. So ripe was the situation, in fact, that it was only 1 month later the House Un-American Activities Committee urged President Johnson to invoke Title II and more. Chaired by Louisiana Democrat Edwin E. Willis, HUAC called on the president to commit open war against the Black population. Willis, a representative of a major rice-producing state, released HUAC's report, first imputing to Black revolutionaries a plan to engage the U.S. government in guerrilla warfare, then showing how racial identity and the concentration of Blacks in the ghettos would assist in their being isolated and destroyed in a short period of time. While President Johnson did not act on the recommendations of the House Un-American Activities Committee, neither were the recommendations repudiated in any audible way by the White House or either House of Congress. Implicit in developments of the first 2 years of the Nixon administration is the conclusion that similar opportunities for military or paramilitary counterforce would not be passed over. On the contrary, during the comparatively uneventful first year of the Nixon administration, it came forward with incredible police state suggestions of its own, ranging from the president's call for no-knock searches and preventative detention, Attorney General Mitchell's call for the wider use of wiretapping to the call of his deputy, Richard Clandestine, for the use of detention camps, all accompanied by an unparalleled facilitation of such steps. In February 1969, just a month after the Nixon administration took over in Washington, Labor Secretary George P. Shultz was dispatched to the Miami Beach Convention of the AFL-CIO executives, where Shultz set out to smooth relations with that giant arm of organized labor. Outstanding was the issue of the administration's announced intention of controlling inflation by, bluntly stated, causing unemployment, thereby lowering the price of labor. Wow. Treasury Secretary David Kennedy had said as much in his confirmation hearings, and members of the Federal Reserve Board had loudly intimated the same. In an interview at the convention, Shultz essentially reaffirmed that the inflation would be controlled at the expense of the workers rather than at the expense of industry. AFL-CIO President George Meany plainly told a news conference that labor would stoutly resist any administration's move toward unilateral price controls against the working man. Other points of interest and concern included what plans Shultz and the administration had in mind for the job corps, which Shultz's Department of Labor had just inherited from the OEO. There were quiet stories current in Washington that some members of the Shultz staff were proposing that the job corps emphasis be switched from teenagers to family job corps. This idea had some appeal to Shriver when he was the head of the OEO. There were other reports that some members of the Nixon administration were fascinated with the idea of mandatory birth control in connection with family job corps programs. All these things Schultz acknowledged as possibilities, but insisted that they were just ideas that might not work. He and his advisors had thought that we could do something especially for the unwed mothers, he said. He did not spell out what he would have done, especially for unwed mothers, beyond what would have been done for wed mothers who needed economic help and training. For the unwed mother, he said, the Job Corps was a unique answer in that it could provide for all a family's needs. Education for the children, a job of some type for both the mother and the father, food and clothing supplies shipped into them, as Schultz put it. They wouldn't have to leave for anything. Schultz denied, however, that there was any plan to change the Job Corps from a voluntary to a mandatory enrollment program. Later, back in Washington, it became impossible to find anyone among usually good news sources at OEO in labor who would commit himself on what really was to become of the 59 massive Job Corps camps the Nixon administration had announced would be closed. Inflation and labor uncertainty continued to mount. On April 27, 1969, Schultz was a guest on Meet the Press. During preparation for the interview, news sources would either claim up or hint suspiciously whenever the question of the disposition of the closed centers was introduced. Thus, settling this question became a major effort on Meet the Press. As a member of the panel, I asked for a direct reply. Yet, and I quote, Mr. Secretary, President Nixon switched the Job Corps from the Office of Economic Opportunity to the Labor Department. And you have recently announced that you will close about 59 of those centers. You yourself has said that closing those centers will effect a $100 million budget appreciation, but opening the new centers will cost about $24 million. However, there is no indication just yet as to what is to happen to those centers which you are closing, in which the public has invested about $50 million in terms of physical improvements. What is to become of them? Schultz says, we are working with the state government and others in terms of possible usefulness of the physical property involved. Some of it may be useful in new centers that are opened in cities and near cities. In general, we are addressing ourselves to a proper disposition of the property that is present there. I do think that you should remember, just as in a poker game, if you have a bad hand, but you have put a lot of money on the table and you find yourself getting called, there is no point in putting good money after bad. I think the same thing holds true here. Just because you have made an investment, if the investment isn't productive, the best thing to do is to withdraw. Yet, continues, two of the largest camps, Camp Kilmer in New York and New Jersey area, and Camp Parks in California, were improved at a combined cost of about $8 million. These are federal properties. What exactly is to be done with them? Schultz, I think the same point holds again, that just because you have made a bad investment doesn't mean you should continue to pour money into something that isn't working. We are working at the problem of the disposition of these assets, as I said, in an orderly way. I can't tell you precisely what will happen to those properties. Yet continues, at the labor convention in February in Miami, you indicated to me that you were favorably disposed to use your term toward a family job corps, that is, a job corps in which the entire family might be enrolled. Might these centers be used in that way? Schultz says, I think one of the thoughts that we have in mind as we project the fiscal 1970 picture, and the Labor Department won't be running the Job Corps until the 1st of July. It is not in the Labor Department right now, but one of the things that we have in mind is what we have called in-city or near-city type centers. We think one possibility to try is to bring the unwed mother into a center of that kind, which there can be a reasonable residential setting, an opportunity for some training, and some daycare for children. That is an idea we will try to make work. It may not work. We hope it will. We will proceed to examine it if we try it and judge it as we go along. Secretary Schultz, of course, did not answer the question of what actually would happen at these centers in which the taxpayers had invested so heavily. Schultz was an economist with a national reputation, having been dean of the Graduate Business School at the University of Chicago. Someone so professionally dollar conscious could not have overlooked a $50 million detail like what would have been done with 59 closed Job Corps. Two, as journalist Allen pointed out in his report on concentration camps, the 6 camps set up in 1952 were, from a space standpoint, simply inadequate to handle the masses entailed should Title II of the Mccarran Act be implemented. Such implementation would move the federal and local police to apprehend and detain astronomical numbers of anti-war protesters, civil rights demonstrators, intellectual eunuchs, Black Panthers, communists, Panther sympathizers, communist sympathizers, and others whom the administration would regard as violence-prone or ideological misfits. Allen's 1966 investigation of the Title II camps showed a total known capacity, even counting 7 other sites available for use as the detention centers, of only 26,500. Thus, assuming that a respectable number of the detainees would be kept alive and require normal space, that 26,500 capacity would not cover those, say, in the lead flank of the November 15, 1969 Vietnam moratorium of some 400,000 persons who marched the nation's capital. But closed Job Corps camps, that's another matter. Thus, a final series of questions to Secretary Schultz. Let me grab some water. All right, thanks. Yet asks another series of questions. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to go back, if I may, to the disposition of these Job Corps centers, which are being closed, and relate them to current social problems. The May issue of the Atlantic Monthly magazine quotes Deputy Attorney General Richard Clandestin as saying, protest demonstrators should be rounded up and put in a detention camp, end quote. Both Washington papers this morning, the Post and the Star, carry stories in which Mr. Clandestin denies he was accurately quoted. However, in view of the enormous investment that such facilities as Kilmer and Parks have experienced with no apparent use for them, as you indicated a few minutes ago, might they, in fact, be used for such purposes? As he saw the question coming, Secretary Schultz began a kind of frown and wagging of his head as he pled with me not to complete the question. When the question was through, he sat for a long, embarrassing pause and finally responded with a classic dodge, which was, in effect, an admission that even an obvious dodge would be less incriminating than the truth. Schultz, I think I will just duck on that one. Yet, in other words, they might be. Schultz, no, I am not going to get into an argument between the Washington Post and Mr. Clandestin. Yet, says, it isn't an argument between them, sir. The question is, since you have the authority with respect to those centers, the public has invested at least $50 million in their improvement. They are there now. They are federal properties. Some of them, what is to be done with them? Schultz, this is something that we are studying, and we are going to have some constructive uses as much as we possibly can. The interview ended in a few minutes later, and the reporters gathered around Schultz to hear his reaction. "That was unfair of you to ask me that question," he said. "I don't see why, sir. You're a responsible public official, and the taxpayers have a right to know." "I know," he said in words that seemed to wink, "but I don't want to be the one to say that those kids are going to be locked up in those camps." He never denied that they would be. No alarms or even well-mannered inquiries greeted the Nixon administration on the concentration camp question, ducked on national TV by a member of the president's cabinet. But there was an increase in public awareness and concern, and that concern began to be reflected in the efforts of certain congressmen. Those of Japanese American descent felt the experience of World War II concentration camps, and in 1969, they led the move toward the repeal of the Mccarran Act, followed closely by a Black congressman. On April 18, 1969, 2 weeks before the Schultz Meet the Press interview, Senator Daniel K. Inouye of Hawaii, a Japanese American who lost an arm fighting his racial kinsmen during World War II, introduced the bill seeking the repeal of Title II of the Mccarran Act. By Senate rules, the bill went to the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by Mississippi Senator James O. Eastland. In the House, companion bills were introduced by Japanese American Spark Matsuga of Honolulu, Abner J. Mikva of Chicago, Chet Hollyfield of Montebello, California, John Conyers Jr. of Detroit, and others. By House rules, the bills were repealed were referred to the House Internal Security Commission, formerly the House Un-American Activities Committee, the same group which in 1968 called for the use of such camps. Introducing his repeal bill to Congress, Matsuga told his House colleagues, quote, "Following the enactment of the Internal Security Act of 1950, 6 detention camps were prepared and maintained by the Department of Justice from 1952 to 1957, 2 in Arizona and 1 in each Pennsylvania, Florida, Oklahoma, and California. Beginning in 1958, Congress stopped appropriating funds for their continued maintenance, so these camps were either abandoned or converted to other uses. With these camps no longer in existence, and with the unreasoning anti-communism of the early 50s no longer a political fetish, Title II was more or less forgotten. About 2 years ago, however, rumors were rampant that the government was again preparing detention camps under the authority of the Emergency Detention Act for dissidents, activists, militants, and others with whom those in public office might disagree. The present national climate shows that it is not enough for the Justice Department officials to deny the existence of emergency detention camps or for the government to say that it does not intend to build them or that there are no present plans to invoke Title II. As President Truman stated in his 1950 veto message, quote, "It is not enough to say that this probably would not be done. The mere fact that it could be done shows clearly how the bill would open a Pandora's box of opportunities for official condemnation of organizations and individuals for perfectly honest opinions. The basic error of these sections is that they move in the direction of suppressing opinion and belief." End quote. I strongly urge others who believe in justice and fair play to join in co-sponsoring this legislation, which would remove the legal sanction for American concentration camps and thereby uphold constitutional safeguards for individual liberty. A law as repugnant to our American way of life as the Emergency Detention Act should not be permitted to remain in our statute books. Holyfield also urged his House colleagues to repeal the concentration camp measure and reminded Americans that use of such camps could happen again. Quote, in the years since this measure was enacted, no government official has put it to use. The fact that it exists, however, has been the basis for serious anxiety among certain segments of the population. These anxieties generally are brought about because of our memories of the way such camps were used in Nazi Germany, and in the fact that the US citizens of Japanese extraction were once incarcerated in, quote, protective custody, does little to allay fears that this could happen again in America. As long as Title II is on the books, it could be used, and some American citizens would probably be arrested and detained before its constitutionality could be ruled on by the courts. Perhaps the most direct message sent to the Black masses about the danger and reality of concentration camps came from Representative Shirley Chisholm of Brooklyn, the first Black woman in Congress. Jet magazine, perhaps the most thoroughly read publication by the Black masses, reported Mrs. Chisholm's testimony before the House Internal Security Committee in an effort to repeal Title II. Congressman Shirley Chisholm testified in favor of the repeal of the Emergency Detention Act of 1950 before the House Internal Security Committee in Washington, D.C. The freshman legislator said, I stand here today looking over events of the past 2 decades, and I am afraid and angry. I see democracy dying, and it is not the red menace that is killing it. I see roots of fascism in this country. There is a distinct pattern emerging to repress freedom of the press and freedom of the individual. Congressman Chisholm, who says that she feels that she and the other 8 Black members of the House must, because of their small numbers relative to the nation's 22 million Black Americans, respond to the needs of all minority groups, added, the majority of Black people do not believe that the Emergency Detention Act has been on the books for 20 years. They reason that white supremacist organizations such as the KKK and the Minutemen have armed themselves to the teeth, and no attempts such as at the law and order events that I have mentioned were used to stop them. Why now? Why against the Panthers? The history of this country necessitates that people of color regard a bill of this nature with fear of even further oppression. History has recorded the white man's treatment of the American Indian. It has recorded the events of slavery, and again, the events during World War II when Japanese Americans were ruthlessly swept into concentration camps, end quote. She further noted that despite highly organized and visible activity by German American Bund during the Second World War, no German Americans were thrown in American concentration camps. Why? There could be only one reason: because they were white, end quote. These appeals, plus increasing public concern and awareness of the danger, eventually moved the Nixon administration to pose on the side of those who wanted the Mccarran Act repealed. In fact, the public attention given the provision diminished to some degree its impregnability, hence its tactical value was open to reassessment. She just texts, was open to reassessment in view of the growing public awareness and concern. On October 23rd, 1969, a group of Black persons descended on the office of Attorney General Mitchell for a secret meeting on civil rights. The group included SCLC President Dr. Abernathy, Dr. King's widow, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Gary, Gary, Indiana, Mayor Richard G. Hatcher, and Detroit Congressman John Conyers Jr. The White House was presented. Sorry about that. Excuse me. The White House was presented at the meeting by Leonard Garment, one of President Nixon's closest advisors on minority affairs. Reported columnists Roland Evans and Robert Novak After airing grievances against the administration's position to extend the Voting Rights Act beyond the South and deteriorating relationships between big city police departments and Black ghettos, Mitchell's visitor pulled no punches in asking administration backing for repeal of Title II. With congressional liberals pushing hard for the same thing, Mitchell agreed to consider it, but left the final decision up to Deputy Attorney General Richard Clandestin, who was not present. Clandestin read the minutes of the October 23rd meeting and 6 weeks later rendered his decision. He announced it last Wednesday, December 3rd, 1969, in a letter to Chairman James O. Easterling, D. of Mississippi of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who favors repeal, but as a trade-off to liberals for a new, tough internal security law. This Deputy Attorney General Clandestin, of course, is the same Deputy Attorney General who had been quoted as calling for the use of concentration camps for protest demonstrators just 6 months earlier. And Senator Eastland is the same Senator Eastland who had called for the use of camps 2 weeks after Title II was enacted in 1950. The mystery of this apparent change of heart by these two men is largely solved in the fact that there was no change of heart at all, but rather a change in tactics. Even Evans and Novak hinted at the tactics in Eastland's willingness to suffer repeal of Title II in exchange for a new, tough internal security law, thus publicizing the possible surrender of a demonstrably heinous law in exchange for an obscure law that achieves the same thing with a few new flourishes. Responding to the Inouye bill for repeal of Title II in the summer of 1969, Senator Eastland said concentration camps could be sacrificed because I don't think they are necessary. The Mississippi senator could say that, secure in the knowledge that repeal of Title II was still in the hands of himself and his counterparts on strategic committees of the House. In short, regardless of what he and others said, Eastland and his rice empire confers would have the clout to block the repeal if they chose. Beyond that, Eastland, 6 months earlier in January 1969, had already quietly arranged for any such eventuality as sacrificing Title II of the Internal Security Act of 1950. He had introduced his own new version, the Internal Security Act of 1969. He and his compatriots could control the repeal of one just handedly as they could control passage of the other. But there was absolutely no likelihood that the old one would disappear without the new one being on the books. Eastland, again, through his power as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, was assured control of either eventuality. In any event, Eastland's Judiciary Committee approved and reported out to the full Senate the inaugural repeal bill on December 8, 1969, just 5 days after the Nixon administration publicly agreed to the idea. It was not the kind of action that results from a lack of warm understanding between the White House and the Congressional Committee. Senator Eastland could say the Mccarran Act concentration camps are unnecessary also because of the fact that his subcommittee would literally make every man's home his own detention center. For example, Title VI of the Eastland bill, entitled Travel Control, empowers to the Secretary of State to curtail sharply areas of foreign travel by U.S. citizens. Title V provides penalties up to $5,000 fine and a year in jail for any citizen outside the United States who fails to respond to a subpoena from any congressional committee. Title IV would fine any citizen $5,000 and jail him up to 5 years for failing to surrender his passport upon the request of the State Department. And under the same title, no person failing to swear allegiance to the United States would be permitted to receive or use any credentials identifying him as a U.S. citizen. The substance of the provisions mentioned above is to tie every citizen closer to the lines of control held tightly by Senator Eastland and those of like power and sentiments in Congress. Those who remain in the United States will not find the pursuit of happiness an easy venture under the Eastland Bill should it be enacted. There are provisions which will go even beyond the Mccarran Act by making the Mccarran wartime prohibitions against sedition apply even when there is no declaration of war. Title I states, quote, whoever owing allegiance to the United States knowingly and willfully gives aid or comfort to an adversary of the United States by an overt act within the United States or elsewhere shall be fined not more than 10,000 or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. As used in this section, the term adversary of the United States means any foreign nation or armed group which is engaged in open hostilities against the United States or with which the armed forces of the United States are engaged in open hostilities, end quote. Such a prohibition, of course, would cover all of the peace demonstrators against the undeclared war in Indochina, since the Viet Cong engages U.S. forces. Similarly, the Eastland Bill defines sedition as anyone advancing the objectives of the world communist movement, end quote. Indiana University constitutional law professor Patrick Bowd calls such a definition void for vagueness clearly unconstitutional. Professor Bowd further points out that one of the announced objectives of the communist doctrine is world peace. Under that, you could be jailed for advocating for world peace, end quote. The Eastland Bill provides other measures, such as the one that destroys the Fifth Amendment, granting immunity against self-incrimination. A riot under the bill is an act or acts of violence by one or more persons, part of an assemblage of three or more persons, which act or acts shall constitute a clear and present danger of, or shall result in, damage or injury to the property of any other person or to the person of any other individual, or even a threat or threats of the commission of an act or acts of violence by one or more persons, end quote. Laws, whether they be the Mccarran Act, the Eastland Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, are merely tools which may be used to reach an objective. The Mccarran Act and the Eastland Bill are demonstrably oppressive as no-knock search and preventative detention measures. The political machinery which controls the passage or defeat of such legislation rarely favors the less extreme forces in Congress. The machinery is in the hands of men who want bad tools. For example, in both the 90th and 91st Congresses, Senate Judiciary Chairman Eastland introduced his Internal Security Act, whose threat of possible passage he uses to keep in hostage those congressmen who wish to repeal the Mccarran Act. He is aided by his position as committee chairman, which gives him the authority to call a bill up for action or to let it die at the end of each session of Congress. Political pressure on Eastland during the 91st Congress forced him to release Senator Inouye's bill for the repeal of Title II of the Mccarran Act. But at the same time, as chairman also of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, Eastland achieved favorable subcommittee action on his own bill, which he could call up for final action at the strategic moment. That strategy is synchronized with delayed House action on the Senate-passed bill for the repeal of the Mccarran Act. The bill for repeal had 133 co-sponsors in the House, but could not get House action. House Internal Security Committee Chairman Eichert opposed the measure and let it die in committee. With these oppressive measures have come the facilities for carrying them out. such as the Mccarran Act concentration camps, closed Job Corps centers, and the regional detention facilities under the new Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. The existence of oppressive legislation alone make a strong case for the capability of legal genocide. But the existence of both an oppressive climate and detention camps began to make the minimal case for probability and intent. Chapter 7, getting ready to read chapter 7, the reality. And I believe this is the last chapter. Yep, the reality. This is the last chapter, everybody. Make sure you guys are liking the video. Be sure to share it out, and want to make sure that we are getting folks in here. This is a good book, and we're learning a lot about how the federal government works to oppress the masses. Okay. Chapter 7, the reality, page 294. So now it is out in the open, began an editorial in the Washington Afro-American. Now the sordid truth has pressed its ugly mien through the bland, respectable-looking cover of the House Un-American Activities Committee report. This reaction to the House Un-American Activities report calling for the destruction of Black people in ghetto colonies came from a Black newspaper whose optimism over a 76-year history had buoyed the spirits of oppressed people newly out of slavery and into what had appeared to be a decade of genuine fulfillment. The Afro-American newspapers had confidence in the ultimate reversal of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, setting up separate but equal forces with the strength of constitutional law. Their editors had urged Black men to fight in 2 world wars with the confidence that ultimately their loyalty and sacrifice would be rewarded with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Their publisher had financed signal court cases leading to the 1954 Brown decision against separate but equal, and had provided the nation and Congress with evidence on which to base the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Through it all, the Afro-American and other major Black media had unstintingly counseled nonviolence and seeking redress and patience in the struggle. But this report from the HUAC, quoted in part 1, was different. It did not arrive unrelated to its time and the events around it. And its call to destroy Black Americans came in context of reality. Their destruction was taking place. Thus, the Afro-American editorial continued, quote, now it is admitted that if some colored Americans are sufficiently determined to assume by force their rightful place of manhood in this society, some of the white power structure is prepared to set aside Magna Carta, the Constitution, preachments on due process, and all the rest. Now, an instrumentality of the legislative branch of the federal government has admitted that in its sinister mind, it is prepared to follow the morally venomous route of Hitler's Germany by using concentration camps in which to detain colored political militants. Responsible colored leadership has been telling ghetto dwellers that such proposals were only rumors conjured up by political radicals like H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael. Colored citizens will want to know why, in the case of poverty-stricken slum dwellers in a land that preaches equality before the law, the idea of individual guilt and punishment could be so quickly recommended into limbo and replaced by one of mass guilt and mass punishment. They will want to know why other important structure figures allowed 10 minutes to pass before damning these proposals by racist-minded HUAC members. They will ask themselves, are Stokely and Rapp right? Is this ultimate plan genocide for all non-whites in sight? End quote. Many Black intellectuals and civil rights activists had been answering those questions in the affirmative with increasing fervor during the decisive decade. Only 6 weeks before he died, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. foresaw the government's cordoning off the ghetto with barbed wire fence. But a year earlier, in 1967, others beginning to face the reality in general circulation publications, a new level of danger consciousness began to emerge during the summer of 1967, underscored by serious uprisings in Newark and other cities, and in the mood of the Black Power Conference in Newark. During that time, the New York Post ran a series of articles on Black Power, featuring interviews with key men in the Black struggle. The interviewer, Jerry Tallmer, put questions to such men as Lincoln Lynch, then 46 and the Associate National Director of CORE, and Conrad Lynn, then 58 and a lawyer long active in radical causes. Said Lynch, quote, "The simple fact is that the vast majority of white America is racist. Now, please, Mr. Tallmer, I'm giving you my own experience. That is my experience. So that is what what is at stake here is not whether I can get a decent apartment in Manhattan or Mississippi or sit on a beach in California, but whether I live at all," end quote. Lynch tried to explain what some Black activists call Black nationalism. "Let me put it another way," Lynch said, quote, "We think of Harlem as a colony, a nation within a nation. Now, our aim is not to establish a separate nation, but I do not see why we could not have an independent city," end quote. Tallmer had Conrad Lynn react to Lynch's colony concept of Black existence. Quote, "In American society," Lynn was quoted, "it is not possible to have a successful revolutionary change with Black people alone because whites will just isolate the Black people and smash them in the end. Imagine talking about Harlem as a nation. How long would Harlem survive as a nation? 6 days?" End quote. Then Tallmer put the issue to Lynch again. Quote, "Okay," said Tallmer, "an independent Harlem. But let me ask, where would Harlem get its water, its gas, its electricity, its money, its food, its automobiles, its jobs? I mean, push to the last analysis, absolute and complete independence." Tallmer reports that Lynch's response came in a fusion of feeling. "Do you know what you're saying?" Lynch asked his interviewer. "You're saying that when it gets right down to it, white people are ready to cut us off, to kill us." Conceded Tallmer, "If you push it to the last analysis, that's exactly what I'm afraid will happen." If this was true when Lynch spoke in 1967, it was more true in 1969. In 1968, for example, the late Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen, Republican of Illinois, himself no semblance of John Brown, and instead a supporter of presidential candidate Nixon, reached the point of disgust in the call for liquidations in mail sent to him by people who thought him likely to go along. In his syndicated column, Senator Dirksen discussed some of the less explosive demands pressed upon him. Quote, "I want to expose to you an example of some of the terrible stuff that comes to us in Congress from little organizations that attempt to chip away at the greatness of our freedom. It is a folder of hate and deceit that comes to Washington out of the West. The theme of the message in the folder is one of hate because it proposes terrible things like concentration camps for militant Americans and work camps for so-called lazy Americans. The theme is also one of deceit because it purports to reflect the mood of grassroots of our population and because it ties hateful ideas to the most welcome cry of a century, reduce taxes," end quote. Its front page title or blurb screams out, quote, "This is what the people want, based on a meticulous survey in the grassroots," end quote. Inside, it sets forth 49 items and demand that send the chills down your back. The items are listed in highly extreme, very racist, and quite illogical language. Here are some of the less explosive demands made by the little organization that pretends to speak for the grassroots. Now, presuming that the reader of the folder has been won over with the demand for less taxes, the message goes on: destroy Castro and liquidate the communist regime in Cuba. End quote. Cuba is a sovereign country. To destroy Castro would mean a declaration of war upon another country, with all that such a venture implies. And what is that word liquidate doing in a communication, however anonymous, to a senator? This one is frightening in concept. Enlarge our prison complexes into great outdoor encampments for disciplinary action. End quote. Who would want concentration camps in America? There you have a prime example of racist propaganda that would try to tear us apart even more than we are torn today. Nobody in his right mind could believe this stuff comes out of a hole in somebody's head as an expression of the people, the grassroots. Yet it is only one small example of the terrible proposals that are made to congressmen that try to convince us that Americans are not, after all, freedom-loving, sane people. End quote. Almost a year before Senator Dirksen's column and the HUAC report, Floyd B. McKissick, then National Director of CORE, was already asking Black people to face the reality of their danger. The title and content of his speech, Genocide USA, a Blueprint for Black Survival, set the context of the threat of the new decade. McKissick told a starkly attentive crowd, quote, "You ask, would America intentionally starve Black people in Mississippi, feed Indians only if they agreed to domination by white people? Would America allow thousands of Blacks to be wasted on the streets of Newark or Buffalo, Watts or Atlanta because they simply said, take your foot off our necks? Would America destroy the lives of millions of Blacks whose forebears as slaves made and developed this economic political system by their blood, sweat, and free labor? Is there not a word called respect, another word called mercy, another justice? Many Jews in Germany thought so during Hitler's regime. They discovered differently. Would America systemically destroy 22 million Blacks? My answer is, look at the record. More specifically, I believe they can, and I believe they will. No, genocide is not a simple matter. It cannot just happen. One group of people cannot just go ahead. Where did I lost my place here? Yes, says it cannot just happen. One group of people cannot just go ahead and wipe out another group of people. They must first pass through several stages. They must live out a peculiar and deadly pattern. The first prerequisite for a nation capable of genocide is the belief that they are superior to their victims. They must believe that they are entitled to control the life and death of their victims. During Hitler's regime, the Germans were supplied with elaborate charts and complicated theses, supposedly proving the superiority of the German people. It is interesting to note that at the bottom of these charts were the colored people of the world, most conspicuously the Black people. Genocide is a political decision. It can be made by a town, city, state, nation, or group of nations. It was a political decision, for example, to exterminate the communists in Indonesia. It was a political decision for the CIA to engineer the coup. It will be interesting to watch what will happen in the near future in such places as Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. We cannot let those patterns, which have already been applied so successfully around the world and which are already in motion in this country be carried to their logical ultimate conclusion. These patterns must be halted now, and we must be the ones to do it. We cannot expect help from anyone but ourselves. This is not a problem of civil rights. It is a problem of Black survival. The concept of civil rights is pitifully insignificant when our very lives are at stake. End quote. Fear, pessimism, even alarm are not new to the post-slavery struggles of Black Americans. But always during the decisive decade, there were public pronouncements of public stances to counter fears, pessimism, and alarming rhetoric. The new decade is different. Serious reassurances from the Nixon administration are rare. Such rarity caused reporters to press Black college presidents as to why they would feel hopeful after leaving there more than 2 hours with President Nixon in the spring of 1970. I have hope and confidence, quote, Morgan State College President Martin D. Jenkins explained in plain consternation. There is little in the historical record which would lead to this conclusion, and yet, as a Black and an American, I must believe, if I believe in this nation, I must believe that it will move forward, and that it will move forward under the President of the United States. I can take no other position than that, end quote. On this, Washington Post commented, this constitutes perhaps the highest form of loyalty not to a particular government or administration, but to the ideals and purpose of which that government was established. What Dr. Jenkins was saying was that against admittedly great odds and in the face of the available evidence, he clings nevertheless to conviction that the American people are still going to make good on the promise of American life, end quote. The Post editorial recited some of the barriers a Black American's hope and confidence had to hurdle. Quote, consider that Dr. Jenkins made his statement only a few days after 6 Black men, all shot in the back by police firearms, were found dead in Augusta, Georgia. He made that statement in the immediate aftermath of a grand jury finding that Chicago police, on the pretext of making an arrest, had wantonly fired nearly 100 rifle shots into a Black Panther hangout, killing a Black Panther national leader. He made that statement on the heels of the tragedy in Jackson, Mississippi, where 2 college students were killed and 9 more were wounded because state highway police poured a fusillade of shots into a dormitory. And he made that statement immediately after taking to President, whose Department of Justice had announced support of tax exemption for private schools set up in the South to circumvent the civil rights laws and the Supreme Court's school desegregation decision, end quote. Indeed, there was little in the new decade to warrant Black hope and confidence based on a protective rather than a punitive federal government. Small wonder then that of Black Georgia state legislator Julian Bond would say, quote, if you could call Adolf Hitler a friend of the Jews, you could call President Nixon a friend of the Blacks, end quote. Or that the Harlem Congressman, Adam Clayton Powell, would admonish Blacks to go without food if necessary and buy a gun to halt such murders as those at Jackson State. Such dread was not even confined to Black politicians who feared for their young. Addressing an Indiana University alumni gathering in May 14, 1970 in Roslyn, Virginia, Senator Vance Hart, Democrat of Indiana, expressed the fear that federal repression against students and the campuses will take our children and relegate them to the gas chamber, at least in the rhetorical sense, if not in the physical sense, end quote. The most alarming fears expressed by the Carmichaels, Lynn's, McKeesicks, and others were being given substance in reality by the Agnews, Moynahans, and Hutchneckers. It was the beginning of a new era, and in a tribute to former Chief Justice Earl Warren, who symbolized a more hopeful period, Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat of Mississippi, recited a litany of repressions ushered in by the Nixon administration. Thank you all so much for listening. Glad you all are here. And I quote, "Now I fear that we are entering another era of crisis and an era of inaction and retroaggression and repression, easily matching the witch-faced Chief Justice Warren when he arrived in Washington, and an era which will demand frequent profiles and courage if we are to survive as a free people. Many of the signs are small, but they are ominous. Taken separately, some may not seem unbearable or worth fighting about, but taken together, they suggest a trend and a pattern which could lead to an ever faster circle of repression and reaction with no conceivable end. They are gnawing at the precious foundations of our freedom, chipping away piece by piece the barriers against tyranny and oppression which the framers of the Constitution erected. Even to recite calmly a list of the symptoms is to give the impression that 1984 may be less than 14 years away, and that Z could happen here. More wiretapping in more kinds of cases, and assertion of the absolute power to bug dissenters without court orders, pressures for no-knock searches and for detention without bail, the use of scare tactics to discourage attendance at protest gatherings, and the obsessive focus on the few lawbreakers in peaceful crowds of tens of thousands, growing use of domestic spies in schools, in political groups, at public meetings, of informants who sometimes help to foment the very acts that they are supposed to be investigating. Verbal harassment of dissenters by political leaders, not on the merits of the issues involved, but through guilt by association and exaggerated code words. Total lack of sensitivity by those leaders to the issues involved. The Attorney General trying to tell jokes about his wiretapping to an audience that is quite seriously concerned about his wiretapping. The Vice President and the President making light of their affinity to Dixie at a time when the nation's stability may depend on whether that affinity outweighs their affinity to justice. The new application from the Washington demonstration permits with blanks for everything from philosophy to arrest records. A new attempt to prevent disagreeable protests near the White House altogether. The installation in the White House of a journalist with carte blanche to fish through federal tax files and other confidential materials. Executive resistance to a bill to eliminate an anarchistic and frightening provision for federal detention camps, resistance which melted only when it became publicly embarrassing. Serious consideration being given to a proposal to remove 5- and 6-year-old children from their homes into correctional camps on the basis of tests of their potential for latter criminality. Federal stockpiling of huge amounts of tear gas and equipping of federal marshals with shotguns that they do not need or want. Sharp curtailment of the availability of federal parole, the best incentive known to give prisoners hope and a goal as they are rehabilitated. Refusal to support the extension of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the most successful contribution to universal suffrage since the 19th Amendment. Federal encouragement of continued resistance to constitutionally required school desegregation. Court nominees chosen for their willingness to resist constitutional mandates rather than for their eminence or leadership. Official solicitation of letters of endorsements of a court nominee from federal employees and judges but investigating and threatening of government-funded lawyers who write letters opposing the nominee, attempts to ease non-conformance employees out of civil service by applying political tests and by reinvestigating their backgrounds for past participation in protest activities, inspection of incoming foreign mail by federal authorities, a concerted effort to interfere with the freedom of the press led by the number 2 man in the administration, harassing calls to networks by the chairman of the Federal Communication Commission and to local media by a member of the Subversive Activities Control Board by our nation's first information czar, harassment of the National Educational TV Network by the Internal Revenue Service, a constant effort to blame the nation's ills on scapegoats such as the previous Attorney General. Each of you can probably add to that list from your own knowledge items which the public is not yet aware of. And there are others I have omitted. Nevertheless, it is shocking and terrifying list. It betrays a total lack of respect for our heritage of freedom and constitutes an immediate threat to our system. End quote. The reality of increasing repression was consistently felt most keenly by Black groups who saw utter danger to their survival. Ministerial and other groups normally given to moderation and the counsel of forbearance and patience were increasingly in the forefront, warning of imminent danger. One such group, a coalition of civil rights organizations in New York, began 1970 with a plain warning of genocide, reported the New York Post. A series of programs and rallies yesterday marked the beginning of Black Liberation Week, a campaign sponsored by the Black Solidarity Day Committee. The committee is a coalition of civil rights groups led by Dr. Eugene S. Callender, director of the New York Urban Coalition. The campaign is designed to protest the genocide against Black people in this country, according to Reginald Butts, a member of the committee. Mr. Butts and 2 of his colleagues opened the week yesterday with a 15-minute broadcast at 10 a.m. over radio station WWRL, urging Black people to stop work and to listen to the program. Each day of the week has a different theme. Mr. Butts said later in an interview, the first of these themes, quote, "We charge genocide," end quote, was the subject of last night of a rally at IS 201 in Harlem. Those who look for tangible evidence that concentration camps are myths find instead the existence of camps and legal sanctions as well. Those who wish to prove that the government has a policy of genocide can realistically point to the fact that Russia, China, and 73 other countries have signed the 1949 United Nations Agreement outlawing genocide, but not the United States. New rhetoric on the Anti-Genocide Pact was stirred. However, in the aftermath of the Song Mai and the My Lai massacres, reported the New York Times, quote, President Nixon urged the Senate today to ratify the 1949 United Nations Agreement outlawing genocide. Sources on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where the genocide agreement had languished about 21 years, expressed concern that a Senate vote could lead either to an embarrassing defeat or to only a narrow victory unless the president is willing and able to twist arms. In a message to the Senate, the president said, quote, "We should delay no longer in taking the final convincing step, which would reaffirm that the United States remains strongly opposed to the crime of genocide as ever," end quote. Senator J.W. Fulbright, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said he had no comment on the genocide agreement. "I haven't thought about it for months," he said. There were no immediate indications whether Mr. Nixon would actively seek support for ratification of the agreement by states' rights advocates and Southern conservatives who traditionally have been reluctant to grant their consent. Officially called the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the agreement bans attempts to wipe out national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups by killing their members or deliberate attempts to cause serious bodily or mental harm to large numbers of members of such groups. The Times further reported that the American Bar Association has opposed the U.S. ratification of the agreement for 20 years, despite the fact that the pact went into effect in other countries as early as 1951. Opposition to the pact is by no means limited to the ABA. Powerful Rice Cup congressmen also opposed ratification. One of them, Louisiana Congressman John R. Rarick, cloaked his opposition, unsurprisingly, in patriotism. Quote, "Our first duty is to safeguard the protection of individual liberties as provided in the Constitution of these United States and the Bill of Rights by preserving the sovereignty of the United States, rights and privileges which would be infringed if genocide treaty is ratified. The genocide treaty was designed to outlaw any mass extermination of any group of humans because of their national, ethnic, racial, or religious classification. As Americans, there can be no question of our abhorrence of genocide against any peoples or our desire to prevent such action. But we must stand eternally vigilant so that our emotional reaction to such crimes against humanity does not blind us into surrendering the basic liberties of our heritage as free men. The wording of the treaty would grant discretionary powers and is far too vague in its definitions. It includes as an act of genocide causing mental harm and makes complicity a genocide punishable as a crime. Further, the treaty would extend to acts of private citizens, acts domestic in nature, but which could be brought under the jurisdiction of an international organization or foreign jurist. I shudder even to consider the structure of such basic tenets as freedom of speech, religion, press, petition, and assembly by nationals of a foreign country whose laws and customs have never permitted the open discussion or individual freedoms which our citizens have historically enjoyed. We must stand guard against every act which lead to piecemeal overthrow of American sovereignty. Free men don't, with full understanding, trade in their liberty because of sugar-coated appeals to join an organization to prohibit acts that have never committed. Our responsibility is to perpetuate the liberties of unborn generations under proven American principles. Ratification of the Genocide Treaty will betray to our people the gift of liberty they entrusted to us as their stewards, end quote. Rarick and many others insist on arguing that committing the nation against killing off a segment of its people somehow undermines constitutional guarantees. However, an editorial in the Washington Post in mid-1970 more candidly faced the real issue, which Rarick and others will only allude to. Commented the Post, quote, "The failure of the United States to ratify the Genocide Convention has left an unsightingly stain on the good name and the high pretensions of this nation. A leader in the long quest for international order and justice, it was a very large measure through the effort, the leadership of the United States, that the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Genocide Convention by unanimous vote in 1948. 75 nations speedily ratified it, but to the perplexity and the consternation of the world, the United States Senate, pressured by a cabal of Southern lawyers in the American Bar Association, turned the convention in anxiety and withheld this country's ratification. Genocide, as defined in the convention, consists of the deliberate and systematic extermination of an ethnic or religious group. It was obviously inspired by and aimed against the Nazi program destroying the Jewish people. It is inconceivable that the American people would ever want to engage in genocide. But some Southerners in this country have taken the view that racial discrimination here might be seized upon as the basis for charging the United States with a violation of the Genocide Convention. True, President Nixon did make a symbolic call for action by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but as the Times reported, that political gesture is far from the bold support a president serious about ratification of a pact against genocide would have to give. As the Times explained, if the agreement was approved by the Senate, implementing legislation would have to be adopted to put it into effect. The president said he was not proposing any specific legislation at this time, but said his administration would be prepared to discuss the subject during Senate consideration of the convention. This is the benign neglect on which Black survival largely depends in the new decade. If it is the choice of the new decade, and it appears to be, then the inevitable second choice belongs to Black people in America. That choice is the style in which they and America will die. That's the end. That is the end of the choice. How did you all enjoy this book? Thank you all for listening, but that was the end. This book has really explained how the legislative process takes place in the federal level. For people who are new to the channel, I welcome you and thank you so much for you all being here. Thanks for watching. Please go back and watch this from part 1. This book was written originally in 1971, so it is actually 50 years old this year. And this author, Samuel Yett, right, the first African-American to be the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Newsweek magazine, was actually fired. President Nixon had him fired from Newsweek. But I really hope that you all go back, listen to it starting from part 1. This book has so many powerful nuggets that for me connects to a lot of what we see happening in Black America today. The benign neglect that he just talked about, we can see continues to happen. We can see that Black people are still relegated to so-called ghettos here in the United States, and neither major party takes our community serious enough to make the investments that are owed, right? These are investments that are owed, right? Specifically for descendants of Africans enslaved here in the United States. So I'm done with this book. Earlier, for the folks who are newer here who came in the middle of me reading, I asked for you all to comment and tell me what would be a suggestion that you would have for the next book that I should read on this channel. I read this book because it's a shadow banned book and it's very hard to come by and it's no longer in print. So I read this book as a service to the community, kind of like, listening to an audio book, only you have to listen to it on YouTube. Okay. So just make sure that you all like this video, you share it, invite your friends and family to come and subscribe to this channel, because I am doing book readings, but I also share content every Thursday at 8 p.m. Content where I am interviewing some expert on a variety of different topics that I believe matter to us as a community and that we don't see in the mainstream press and we don't see in popular culture. So I hope that you appreciate this channel for that. And I certainly hope that you appreciate the time that I put in to read these books, particularly, the shadow banned books. I have a suggestion that I will actually likely start reading The Blueprint for Black Power by Dr. Amos Wilson, who is also an ancestor. But that is a book That is a very, very powerful book that all people, particularly Black folks, should be aware of and know about. Lots of different tools and strategies that's left for us in that book. So I may actually start reading that as my next book. But anyway, thank you all so much for listening. I actually may come back, if not later today, maybe one day this week, to come back and share my reflections on Judas and the Black Messiah. I'm not sure if you guys saw that, but it came out on February 12th. My family and I watched it yesterday, and boy, do I tell you, I got a lot of reflections about that. That movie, as you all know, is true telling of the story of Fred Hampton, and happened all around the same time this book was actually written in the late 60s, early 70s. So anyway, I appreciate you all for being here. Thank you so much. Again, don't forget to like. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure you subscribe to the channel and share this with your family and friends, people who you know like good content, people who like content that's empowering. Then certainly share that with people who you know who would like this kind of content. So thank you all so much for being here. Again, if you want to listen to the full book, just go back to part 1 all the way through. This one is part 7, which we wrapped everything up here. Thank you all so much for your time this evening. And I may hop back on to do a review of Judas and the Black Messiah. We'll see. But good to see you all tonight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and invite your friends and family to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all soon. Take care.